"Our butler is home. He'll serve you champagne," my daughter-in-law said as she welcomed her father into my house, my own house. But when he saw me, panic spread across his face. He shouted, "Do you even know who he really is?" Before she could turn to me, I said something that made her go pale. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Howard. And at 63 years old, I never imagined I'd be serving champagne in my own home while being introduced as the help. But there I was, silver tray in hand, watching my daughter-in-law Leah smile that practiced smile of hers as she welcomed her guests into what used to be my sanctuary. "Our butler is home. He'll serve you champagne," she announced with the kind of casual cruelty that had become her signature. The words hit me like they always did, a sharp reminder of how far I'd fallen in my own house. 6 months ago, I was Howard Mitchell, retired vice president of operations at Consolidated Industries. Today, according to Leah, I was simply the hired help. I stood there in the marble foyer that my late wife Margaret and I had designed together 27 years ago, holding a tray of crystal glasses filled with Dom Perignon that I'd paid for. The irony wasn't lost on me. The guests, 3 couples from Leah's social circle, barely glanced in my direction as I moved between them, offering drinks with the kind of practiced invisibility that Leah had trained into me over the past year. "Thank you," one woman murmured without looking up from her phone. Another simply took a glass and turned away. Already deep in conversation about some charity gala, I might as well have been furniture for all the acknowledgement I received. That's exactly how Leah wanted it. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror as I passed. Gray hair, neatly combed, crisp white shirt, black slacks. I looked the part she'd assigned me. The transformation had been so gradual that sometimes I forgot who I used to be. When did I stop being dad and become the help? When did my own son stop defending me? Speaking of my son, David sat in the living room with his usual distant expression, scrolling through his phone while his wife orchestrated yet another evening where I was relegated to servant status in my own home. He didn't look up when I refilled his glass, hadn't really looked at me. I mean, truly looked at me. In months. "Howard, we need more ice," Leah called from the kitchen, her voice carrying that edge it always had when she spoke to me in front of others. Not Dad, not Howard with any warmth, just Howard, like I was an employee she barely tolerated. I set down the tray and walked to the kitchen, past the family photos that still lined the hallway. Pictures of Margaret and me at our wedding, David's graduation from college, family vacations where we all looked genuinely happy. Those felt like someone else's memories now. The kitchen had been Margaret's domain, and now it was Leah's. She'd rearranged everything, replaced Margaret's cheerful yellow curtains with stark white ones, removed the small herb garden from the windowsill. Even the warmth had been systematically extracted from the room. "The Waterford crystal, not the everyday glasses," she instructed without looking up from her phone, "and make sure they're spotless. Mrs. Henderson notices everything." I nodded and reached for the crystal glasses in the cabinet that had once held Margaret's china. Each piece was a memory being handled by hands that had once been respected in boardrooms across the state. I used to make decisions that affected thousands of employees. Now I was being lectured about water spots on glassware. As I carefully dried each glass, I thought about the meeting I'd attended just 18 months ago, the final board meeting before my retirement. They'd given me a gold watch and a standing ovation. 32 years with the company, they'd said. Irreplaceable, they'd called me. If only they could see me now. "And Howard," Leah's voice snapped me back to the present, "when you serve dinner, remember to serve from the left and clear from the right. We've been over this. We'd been over this." As if I were some new hire still learning the ropes rather than a man who'd hosted dozens of business dinners in this very house. Dinners where I'd been the host, not the help. I returned to the living room with fresh ice and the proper crystal glasses. The conversation flowed around me as I moved through the room, refilling drinks and collecting empty plates from the hors d'oeuvres I'd spent the afternoon preparing. They talked about vacation homes and private schools, investment portfolios and country club memberships, the kind of conversations I used to participate in, back when I was considered worth talking to. "Howard's been such a blessing," I heard Leah tell Mrs. Henderson. "It's so hard to find good help these days, and having him right here in the house makes everything so convenient. Good help, right here in the house. Like I was live-in staff that came with the property." Mrs. Henderson nodded approvingly, glancing at me with the kind of benevolent indifference reserved for well-trained servants. The evening dragged on, each interaction another small cut to what remained of my dignity. When someone spilled wine on the coffee table, they didn't even bother to apologize, just looked at me expectantly until I appeared with a cloth. When a guest needed directions to the powder room, Leah directed them to ask Howard rather than simply pointing the way herself. By 9 o'clock, as I collected the last of the dinner plates, my back ached, and my pride hung in tatters. The guests were moving to the living room for after-dinner drinks, their laughter echoing through the house that used to ring with Margaret's own laughter. She'd loved entertaining, loved bringing people together. She'd have been heartbroken to see what these gatherings had become. I was loading the dishwasher when David finally appeared in the kitchen. For a moment, I thought he might actually speak to me, might acknowledge that something was deeply wrong with this picture. Instead, he grabbed a beer from the refrigerator and started to leave. "David?" I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. He paused in the doorway but didn't turn around. "What, Dad?" "Dad." The word carried no warmth, no connection, just obligation. "Nothing," I said, turning back to the dishes. "Just nothing." He left without another word, and I continued loading plates that I'd washed by hand every night for the past year, because Leah insisted the dishwasher was too loud for evening entertaining. The irony was that she'd insisted on that particular dishwasher model when they moved in, claiming it was the quietest on the market. As I stood there in my own kitchen, in my own house, wearing the uniform of invisibility that Leah had dressed me in, one thought kept echoing in my mind. How had I let it get this far? When had I stopped being a father and become a convenience? When had I stopped being Howard Mitchell and become simply the help? But what scared me most was realizing that I was starting to forget there had ever been a difference. It hadn't started this way. When David brought Leah home for the first time 3 years ago, she'd been all smiles and sweet compliments about the house, about Margaret's garden, about what a wonderful job I'd done raising such an amazing son. I should have seen through it then, but I was still grieving Margaret's death and desperately lonely in this big house that suddenly felt like a mausoleum. Margaret had been gone for 8 months when David announced they were getting married. 8 months of me rattling around in a 4-bedroom house, eating cereal for dinner and falling asleep in my recliner because our bedroom felt too empty. When they asked if they could stay with me temporarily while they saved for a house, I practically begged them to move in. It would mean so much to have family close, I'd told David, my voice thick with emotion I hadn't meant to show. Your mother always said this house was meant to be filled with family. Leah had hugged me then, tears in her eyes that I now suspect were as fake as everything else about her. "Oh, Dad," she'd said, the first and last time she'd ever call me that with any warmth. "We'd love to help you through this difficult time. Help me." Even then, she was positioning herself as the one doing the favor. The first few weeks were wonderful. Leah cooked elaborate dinners, insisted I join them for meals, asked about my work stories in Margaret's garden. She'd curl up on the couch with David while I sat in my chair, and for brief moments, it felt like I had a family again, like the house was alive. But slowly, things began to shift. It started with small suggestions. "Dad, why don't you let me handle the grocery shopping? I'm going anyway, and I know exactly what we need." Then it was the laundry. "You shouldn't be carrying those heavy baskets up and down the stairs at your age. Let me take care of that." At first, I was grateful. It felt like care, like concern for my well-being. Margaret had always handled most of the household management, and I was honestly overwhelmed trying to figure out which laundry detergent to buy, or how to plan meals for more than one person. But the suggestions became instructions, and the instructions became expectations. Within 2 months, I was doing all the grocery shopping because Leah was too busy with wedding planning. I was handling all the yard work because David works such long hours, and you love being outside anyway. I was cooking dinner most nights because you're here all day and we don't get home until after 6. The wedding planning consumed their lives for months. I offered to help with expenses. Margaret and I had saved diligently, and I wanted David to have a beautiful wedding. What started as offering to pay for the flowers turned into paying for the entire reception. When I hesitated at the cost, $12,000 for one evening, Leah's face fell. "I understand if you don't want to help," she'd said, her voice wounded. "I just thought, after everything we've done for you, taking care of you, keeping you company, but I understand if that doesn't mean anything." David had looked uncomfortable but said nothing. He'd gotten good at saying nothing when Leah was concerned. I ended up writing the check. After the wedding, things accelerated. They'd been back from their honeymoon for less than a week when Leah sat me down for what she called a family meeting. "Dad," she'd begun, and even then the word sounded different coming from her lips. "David and I have been talking and we're concerned about you." Concerned about me? I was 62 years old, in good health, had just retired with a full pension and substantial savings. What was there to be concerned about? "You seem so isolated," she continued, "staying in this big house all day, not really having any structure or purpose. We think you might be getting depressed." I started to protest, but she held up a hand. "We've been researching, and isolation is a major problem for men your age. What you need is routine, responsibility, a sense of being useful. So we've come up with a solution that helps everyone." The solution was that I would take on more of the household responsibilities while they focused on building their careers. It made sense. she explained. I was home all day anyway, and they were working full-time. It was only fair that I contribute to the household in non-financial ways. Think of it as a partnership, she'd said with that bright smile. You handle the day-to-day running of the house, and we'll handle our careers and building our future. Everyone contributes what they can. It sounded reasonable when she put it that way. It sounded like teamwork, like family supporting each other. David nodded along, trusting his wife to navigate the delicate family dynamics he'd never been particularly good at managing. So I started doing the cooking and cleaning. I handled the laundry and the shopping. I maintained the yard and dealt with repair services. At first I told myself I was helping. I was contributing. I was part of a team. But the appreciation stopped coming. The thank yous disappeared. When I'd spend all day preparing an elaborate dinner, Leah would critique the seasoning or suggest I try a different recipe next time. When I'd spend hours cleaning the house, she'd point out spots I'd missed. When I'd grocery shop, she'd go through the receipts and question my choices. Dad, we really can't afford to waste money on name brand items when the store brand is perfectly fine. We're trying to save for our own house, remember? Our own house. The house they were supposedly saving for became the carrot that kept me compliant. Just until they could afford their own place. Just until David got his promotion. Just until Leah's student loans were paid off. Always just until something else that never seemed to arrive. The worst part was how they began talking about me in front of me, as if I weren't there. Dad's having trouble remembering things lately, Leah would tell people. We're keeping an eye on him. Or Dad gets confused about modern technology. We handle all the important stuff now. Neither of these things was true, but repeating them enough made them sound true. Made me start questioning myself. Was I becoming forgetful? Was I really struggling more than I thought? The social isolation came next. Old colleagues would call and Leah would answer, explaining that I was resting or not feeling up to visitors. She canceled my golf club membership because it was an unnecessary expense. She suggested I stop attending church because people there just gossip and it's not good for your mental health. Within a year, my social circle had shrunk to David, Leah, and whoever they invited to the house. And when they had guests, I was expected to help, setting up, serving, cleaning up. It was never presented as a requirement, just a natural assumption. Dad, could you grab the wine from the kitchen? Dad, would you mind clearing these plates? The requests became commands, became expectations, became my role. I was no longer Howard Mitchell, retired executive. I was Dad who helps out. Then I was just Dad who serves. Finally, I became simply the help. The turning point came 6 months ago when Leah's college friend visited. I was in the kitchen preparing lunch when I heard Leah explaining the arrangement. It works out perfectly, she was saying. Howard was so lost after his wife died and we were struggling to afford our own place. This way, he has purpose and company, and we have help with the house. It's really been a blessing for everyone. Help with the house, not family living together. Help. That night, I lay in the bed I'd shared with Margaret for 34 years and tried to figure out how I'd become a stranger in my own life. Margaret's clothes were still in the closet. Leah had never directly asked me to remove them, but she'd made enough comments about moving forward and healthy grieving that I knew she disapproved. Her books were still on the nightstand, her reading glasses still in the drawer. If Margaret could see me now, what would she think? Would she recognize the man she'd married, the man who'd run meetings with confidence and made decisions that affected thousands of people? Or would she see what I was becoming, a ghost in his own house, grateful for scraps of acknowledgement from people who'd turned him into their personal servant? I closed my eyes and tried to remember the last time David had asked about my day. My thoughts, my feelings, the last time anyone had treated me like my opinions mattered, the last time I'd felt like a person rather than a convenience. I couldn't remember. And that scared me more than anything else. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was scrubbing the kitchen floor. Leah's voice carried that particular excitement she reserved for opportunities to elevate her social status. Daddy's coming for dinner Friday, she announced to David, though I was the one who'd be doing all the work. Richard Blackstone is flying in from New York for some business meetings and he wants to see our home. Richard Blackstone. I'd heard the name countless times over the past 3 years, always spoken with the kind of reverence usually reserved for royalty. Leah's father, the successful investment banker who'd built Blackstone Capital from nothing into a multi-million-dollar empire, the man who'd paid for Leah's private school education, her Ivy League college, her graduate degree that she'd never actually used. This is huge, Leah continued, pacing the kitchen while I continued scrubbing grout with an old toothbrush. If Daddy sees how well we're managing things here, how stable our life is, he might finally offer David that position at the firm. There it was, the real reason for the excitement. For 3 years, Leah had been angling for her father to bring David into the family business. David's background in marketing wasn't exactly investment banking material, but Leah was convinced that proximity to wealth would eventually translate into actual wealth. What should I make for dinner? I asked from the floor, though I already knew the answer would involve me spending the entire day cooking while being invisible during the actual meal. Leah paused her pacing and looked down at me as if surprised I'd spoken. Something impressive but not ostentatious. Daddy appreciates quality but doesn't like show-offs. She tapped her manicured nail against her lip. Beef Wellington, I think, with those little potato things you made for the Hendersons. Beef Wellington, a dish that would require me to spend most of Friday preparing, shopping for specialty ingredients that would cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a month. Also, I could serve it to people who would never acknowledge that I'd made it. And Howard, she added, her tone shifting to that particular cadence she used when giving instructions to the help. Daddy's very particular about service. He's used to fine dining, professional waitstaff. I'll need you to be extra attentive but invisible, if you know what I mean. I knew exactly what she meant. I was to anticipate every need while never appearing to exist, serve without being seen, clear without being noticed, remain available while staying invisible. The perfect servant. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of preparation. Leah hired a service to deep clean the house, though I'd been maintaining it meticulously for months. She rearranged furniture, bought new flowers, and sent me to 3 different stores to find the exact type of mushrooms required for the Wellington. She also coached me extensively on proper service etiquette, as if I hadn't spent decades hosting business dinners in this very house. Remember, serve from the left, clear from the right. Don't speak unless spoken to. Keep wine glasses filled, but never interrupt conversation. And for God's sake, don't drop anything. Friday afternoon, I stood in the kitchen preparing the most elaborate meal I'd cooked since Margaret's last birthday dinner 4 years ago. The beef was perfectly seared, wrapped in its delicate pastry shell. The wine was breathing. A $200 bottle that Leah had selected to impress her father. The table was set with Margaret's finest china, crystal glasses gleaming under the chandelier. As I adjusted my white shirt and black slacks, the uniform Leah had selected for me, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. I looked like exactly what she'd turned me into. Hired help in my own home. At precisely 6 o'clock, a black Mercedes pulled into the driveway. Through the window, I watched a tall, distinguished man in an expensive suit emerge from the back seat. Richard Blackstone moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "He's here," Leah called out, her voice high with nervous excitement. "David, remember what we discussed. Howard, start the music and light the candles." I moved through the familiar routine of setting the evening stage while Leah and David positioned themselves in the foyer. Through the doorway, I watched Leah embrace her father, her performance of domestic bliss beginning immediately. "Daddy, you look wonderful. How was the flight? David's so excited to see you again." Richard Blackstone's voice was deep and commanding, the kind of voice that was used to being obeyed. "The flight was fine, darling. This house is lovely, much larger than I expected. We've been so happy here," Leah gushed, leading him into the living room. "Our butler is home. He'll serve you champagne." Our butler. The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd known they were coming. Standing there with a silver tray of champagne flutes, I felt the last remnant of my dignity crumble. In my own home, I'd been reduced to staff. I entered the living room with practiced invisibility, offering champagne to the man who was essentially my employer's employer. Richard Blackstone took a glass without looking at me, his attention focused on examining the room with the eye of someone calculating value. "Beautiful home," he said, running his finger along the mantelpiece. "These antiques are genuine, early 19th century if I'm not mistaken." "Howard has such good taste," Leah said smoothly, as if I were a decorator she'd hired rather than the man who'd chosen every piece with Margaret over 30 years of marriage. I retreated to the kitchen, listening to their conversation while putting the finishing touches on dinner. Richard's voice carried the authority of someone used to being the smartest person in the room. He asked pointed questions about David's work, about their financial planning, about their living situation. "It's been wonderful having help in the house," I heard Leah explain. "Howard's been with us for over a year now. Very reliable, very discreet. Been with us, as if I were an employee they'd hired rather than the homeowner who'd taken them in. When I returned to serve dinner, carrying the beef Wellington I'd spent all day preparing, something strange happened. Richard Blackstone looked up at me, really looked at me, for the first time since he'd arrived. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to place a half-remembered face. "Thank you," he said quietly, and there was something different in his voice, uncertainty perhaps, or recognition. I nodded and returned to my invisible state, serving vegetables and refilling wine glasses while the conversation flowed around me. Richard spoke about market trends and investment opportunities, painting a picture of a world where millions of dollars moved with casual ease. David listened intently, trying to position himself as someone worthy of joining that world. But throughout the meal, I noticed Richard's eyes following me, as when I reached across the table to refill his wine glass, he studied my face. When I cleared the salad plates, he watched my movements. There was something almost familiar in his expression, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. "The meal is exceptional," Richard said during a lull in conversation. My compliments to the chef. Leah beamed. Howard is very talented in the kitchen. We're so fortunate to have found him, as if I were a stray they'd rescued rather than the man whose home they'd colonized. How long have you been in service? Richard asked, directing the question to me. I opened my mouth to answer, but Leah jumped in smoothly. Howard's been with families like ours for years. He has excellent references. Families like ours. References. I was being discussed as if I were livestock at auction, but Richard wasn't satisfied with Leah's answer. He continued studying me with those sharp gray eyes, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that he was seeing more than Leah wanted him to see. You seem familiar, he said finally, his voice thoughtful. Have we met before? My heart began to race. There was something in his tone, something that suggested this wasn't just polite conversation, something that suggested recognition was dawning. Leah laughed nervously. Oh, Daddy, you probably just recognized the type. Good help has a certain bearing, doesn't it? But Richard wasn't laughing. He was staring at me with growing intensity, his wine glass frozen halfway to his lips. And in that moment I realized with growing dread that whatever he was remembering, it was going to change everything. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. David shifted in his chair, sensing tension he couldn't identify. Leah's smile became strained, her fingers drumming nervously against her wine glass, and Richard Blackstone continued to stare at me, his expression shifting from puzzlement to something approaching shock. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the force of an earthquake. My God, he breathed. Howard Mitchell. The words hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't yet exploded. Howard Mitchell. My full name, spoken with the kind of recognition that made my blood run cold and my heart race simultaneously. Richard Blackstone's face had gone completely white. His wine glass trembled in his hand as he stared at me with growing horror, not at who I was, but at what he was seeing me reduced to. The silence stretched so long that I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, each second marking the approach of a reckoning I wasn't sure I was ready for. I'm sorry, Leah said, with a forced laugh that sounded brittle in the sudden tension. Do you two know each other? Howard, did you work for one of Daddy's associates? Work for? Even now, even faced with whatever recognition was dawning on her father's face, she couldn't conceive of any scenario where I might have been anything other than the help. Richard set his wine glass down with the careful precision of a man trying to maintain control while his world shifted around him. When he looked at me again, his eyes held something I hadn't seen directed at me in over a year. Respect. And beneath that, something that looked suspiciously like fear. Howard Mitchell, he repeated, and this time his voice was stronger, carrying the weight of someone who'd just solved a puzzle that terrified him. Former Vice President of Operations at Consolidated Industries, Regional Manager for the Southeast Division, the man who single-handedly saved the pension fund during the market crash of 2008. The air went out of the room. I watched Leah's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and growing panic as the implications of her father's words began to sink in. David's fork clattered to his plate, his mouth hanging open as he stared between his wife and me. Daddy, what are you talking about? Leah's voice was high and thin, the sound of someone watching their carefully constructed world begin to crumble. Howard is. He's just what? Richard's voice was sharp now, cutting through her stammered protests. Just the help? Just some servant you found? He turned to look at his daughter with an expression I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. Do you have any idea who this man is? I found my voice, though it came out rougher than I'd intended. Mr. Blackstone, it's been a long time. 26 years, he said, never taking his eyes off me. 26 years since the Hartwell Industries merger. You were the one who structured the pension protection clauses, saved 14,000 jobs. The memory came flooding back. Richard Blackstone, 15 years younger then, representing a smaller investment firm that was trying to position itself for the massive Hartwell deal. He'd been aggressive, ambitious, but ultimately outmaneuvered by the larger firms. I'd been the one to throw him a lifeline, including his company in a smaller but significant portion of the post-merger restructuring. You gave me my first major break, Richard continued, his voice thick with emotion I couldn't quite identify. The Hartwell restructuring contract. It was worth $2.7 million to my firm. Without that deal, he shook his head. Without that deal, Blackstone Capital wouldn't exist. Leah was staring at me now with something approaching horror. That's not possible. Howard is. He's our... Your what? Richard's voice was dangerously quiet. Your servant? Your butler? He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Do you have any idea what you've done? The question seemed to hang in the air, and I could see Leah's mind racing, trying to find some way to reframe this situation, to maintain the narrative she'd spent 3 years constructing. But there was no way to spin this. No way to explain how she'd reduced a man who'd once commanded respect in boardrooms across the country to serving champagne in his own home. I don't understand, David said finally, his voice small and confused. Dad, you never said. You never told us. I looked at my son, at the bewilderment and growing shame in his eyes, and felt something crack open in my chest. You never asked, I said quietly. In 3 years of living in this house, neither of you ever asked about my career, my achievements, my life before Margaret died. You just assumed. We assumed what? Leah's voice was defensive now, but I could hear the panic underneath. You assumed I was nothing, I said, and the words came out with a finality that surprised even me. You assumed that because I was grieving and alone I must be helpless, useless, good for nothing but cooking your meals and cleaning your messes. Richard was staring at Leah with something that went beyond disappointment. You turned Howard Mitchell into your household staff, the man who built the operational framework that half the Fortune 500 companies still use today? I didn't know, Leah protested, but her voice lacked conviction. He never said anything. He seemed to enjoy helping out. Enjoy? The word came out of me like a bark of bitter laughter. I haven't enjoyed a single day of the past year. I've endured it. I've survived it. I've submitted to it because I was terrified of losing the only family I had left. The truth of those words hit me like a physical blow. I'd been so afraid of being alone that I'd allowed myself to be erased, so desperate to maintain some connection to my son that I'd let myself be turned into a stranger in my own home. Richard was shaking his head slowly, his businessman's mind clearly calculating the magnitude of what he'd discovered. The networking opportunities alone, he muttered. The connections, the reputation, the expertise. He looked at Leah with something approaching disgust. Do you realize that one phone call from Howard Mitchell could open doors that I've spent decades trying to get through? That's when I saw it. The exact moment when Leah's panic transformed into something else entirely. The moment when she realized that her carefully constructed hierarchy had been completely inverted. That the man she'd spent 3 years treating like hired help was actually someone who could make or break her father's business deals. Howard, she said, and for the first time in months my name came out of her mouth with something approximating respect. I had no idea. If I'd known about your background, your experience. You would have what? I interrupted, standing up from my place at the table, not the head of the table where I should have been sitting, but at the side where Leah had relegated me months ago. You would have treated me like a human being, like family, like someone whose opinion mattered. She opened her mouth to answer, but Richard cut her off. How much? He asked quietly. Excuse me? How much did you pay him for his services? A man of Howard's caliber with his experience and connections. I'm assuming you at least compensated him fairly for reducing him to household staff. The silence that followed was deafening. Leah's face cycled through several expressions before settling on something resembling panic. It wasn't like that, she stammered. Howard is family. He lives here. We take care of him. You take care of him? Richard's voice rose for the first time since he'd recognized me. You mean he takes care of you? In his own house? Cooking your meals, cleaning your messes, serving your guests. He gestured around the dining room. This is his home, isn't it? His furniture, his dishes, his life that you've colonized. David was staring at his plate, his face flushed with what I hoped was shame. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. Dad, he said, his voice breaking slightly. I'm so sorry, I didn't realize. I knew you were successful, but I didn't understand. Understand what? I asked, and I was surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. That I was a person worthy of respect, that I had feelings, that I might not actually enjoy being treated like household staff in my own home. The weight of 3 years of accumulated humiliation was pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. But for the first time in longer than I could remember, I wasn't swallowing it down. I wasn't making excuses or smoothing things over or pretending it didn't matter. Richard was still staring at Leah with something approaching revulsion. You have no idea what you've destroyed, do you? The relationships, the respect, the reputation. He shook his head. Howard Mitchell was one of the most respected operations executives on the East Coast. Board members called him for advice. CEOs flew across the country to consult with him. Past tense. Was. Had been. The words hit me harder than I'd expected, but they also clarified something that had been nagging at me for months. I wasn't that man anymore. Hadn't been for 3 years, but that didn't mean I couldn't be again. Leah was looking between her father and me with growing desperation, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what she'd lost. Not just a servant, but access to a world of influence and power that she'd been dreaming of entering her entire life. Howard, she said, and there was something pathetic in her voice now. Please, we can fix this. We can change how things work around here. I just didn't understand. I looked at her for a long moment, this woman who'd spent 3 years systematically erasing my identity and dignity. Then I looked at my son who'd stood by and watched it happen. Finally, I looked at Richard Blackstone, a man who'd built an empire partly on the foundation of an opportunity I'd given him decades ago. When I spoke, my voice was quiet, but carried a finality that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Some things, I said, can't be fixed. The silence that followed my words stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap at any moment. Richard Blackstone stood frozen at the head of my dining table, his face still processing the full scope of what his daughter had done. Leah's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, while David sat staring at his hands as if they might provide answers to questions he was only now beginning to understand. "Some things can't be fixed," I'd said, and the finality of those words seemed to echo in the room long after I'd spoken them. For 3 years, I'd been the one trying to fix things, to smooth over problems, to make everyone comfortable at the expense of my own dignity. Not anymore. Richard was the first to break the silence, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd just realized the magnitude of a catastrophic mistake. "Howard, I need you to understand something." He turned to face me fully, ignoring his daughter's increasingly frantic expressions. "The Patterson Industries deal that I closed last month, the one that brought in $14 million to my firm, I used your operational restructuring model, the same framework you developed at Consolidated. $14 million. The number hung in the air like an accusation. "I've been using your methodologies for years," Richard continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "The Hartwell principles, the Mitchell protocols. Half the investment banking industry knows those terms. They just don't know where they came from anymore." I felt something shift inside my chest, a recognition of worth that I'd almost forgotten existed. For 3 years, I'd been told I was useful only for cooking and cleaning. Now I was being reminded that my mind had shaped entire industries. Leah finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Daddy, I didn't know. How could I have known?" Richard turned to look at his daughter, and the disappointment in his eyes was so profound that I almost felt sorry for her. "Almost. How could you not know?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Did you never ask about his career, his achievements? Did you never wonder how a man living in a house like this, with furnishings like these, might have acquired them?" "I thought," Leah started, then stopped. What had she thought? That I'd inherited everything? That I'd won the lottery? That successful homes just materialized around unsuccessful people? "You thought he was nobody," Richard finished for her. "You saw a grieving widower and assumed he must be helpless, useless, someone to be managed rather than respected." David finally looked up from his hands, his face flushed with shame. "Dad, I swear I didn't realize what was happening. I thought you were happy to help out, to have company." "Happy?" The word came out of me like a bitter laugh. "When was the last time you asked if I was happy, David? When was the last time you asked me anything about my feelings, my needs, my life?" He opened his mouth, but no words came out, because there was no good answer. There had been no questions about my happiness, no concern for my well-being beyond whether I was available to serve their needs. Richard was shaking his head slowly, his businessman's mind clearly calculating not just the lost opportunities, but the deeper implications of what he'd discovered. "The Morrison Group has been trying to get a meeting with me for 2 years, he said, speaking almost to himself. "They want to discuss a joint venture worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $25 million. $25 million, another number that seemed to physically impact Leah, who was growing paler by the minute. "James Morrison and Howard worked together for 15 years, Richard continued, looking directly at me. "One phone call from you would not only get me that meeting, it would practically guarantee the deal." I could see Leah's mind racing, trying to calculate what this meant, trying to figure out how to salvage a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond her control. But there was no salvaging this. No amount of apologies or promises could undo 3 years of systematic humiliation. "Howard," she said, and for the first time since I'd known her, her voice carried actual desperation. "Please, let's talk about this. We can restructure our living arrangement. You could be more of a consultant, an advisor. We could pay you for your expertise. Pay me, in my own house, for sharing the knowledge and connections I'd built over 32 years of dedicated work." The audacity of it was breathtaking. "A consultant," I repeated slowly, "in my own home. How generous of you." Richard was staring at his daughter with something approaching horror. "Do you hear yourself? You're offering to pay the homeowner to live in his own house, to compensate a man for using his own kitchen, sleeping in his own bedroom, sitting in his own living room." The color drained completely from Leah's face as the full reality of her situation began to sink in. She wasn't a gracious daughter-in-law who'd been taking care of an aging father-in-law. She was a parasite who'd been living off a successful man, while systematically destroying his dignity. "But we've been helping him," she protested weakly, "keeping him company, giving him purpose, making sure he wasn't lonely." "Helping him?" Richard's voice rose for the second time that evening. "You've been exploiting him, using his grief and loneliness to turn him into unpaid household staff while you lived in his home, ate his food, and spent his money." "We contribute to household expenses," David said quietly, but even he seemed to realize how pathetic that sounded. "How much?" I asked, and my voice was steadier than I'd heard it in years. "What? How much do you contribute to household expenses? The mortgage on this house is $2,800 a month. Property taxes are $6,000 a year. Utilities average $400 monthly. Maintenance, insurance, repairs, let's call it another $1,000 a month. How much of that do you cover?" David's face flushed deeper. We pay for groceries sometimes, and we bought that new dishwasher." "Sometimes," I repeated. "You pay for groceries sometimes, while I pay for everything else, plus I cook the meals, clean the house, and serve your guests." The numbers were stark, undeniable. Even Richard, with his investment banker's mind, was visibly calculating the financial imbalance. "Dear God," he murmured. "How much has this cost you, Howard? Over 3 years?" I'd done this calculation myself during many sleepless nights, but I'd never spoken it aloud. Somewhere in the neighborhood of $120,000, not including the value of my time and labor. $120,000. The number hit the room like a physical blow. Leah actually gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "That's not counting," I continued, my voice gaining strength with each word. "The social isolation, the lost connections, the damage to my reputation from disappearing from professional circles without explanation." Richard was nodding grimly. "The networking alone, the relationships you've lost, the opportunities that have passed by while you've been," he gestured helplessly, "while you've been treated like hired help in your own home." "We didn't know," Leah said again, but her voice lacked any conviction. It was the defense of someone who'd willfully chosen not to know, not to ask, not to see what was directly in front of her. "You didn't want to know," I corrected. "It was more convenient to assume I was nobody important. Easier to take advantage of a grieving man than to acknowledge that you were living off someone whose professional achievements far exceeded anything you'd ever accomplished." The words were harsh, but they were true, and for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't softening them to protect someone else's feelings. Richard set down his napkin with the decisive gesture of a man who'd made up his mind about something. "I think," he said carefully, "that my daughter and son-in-law need to find alternative living arrangements." "Daddy, no," Leah said, panic creeping into her voice. "You don't understand. We can't afford our own place right now. David's job doesn't pay enough, and with my student loans." "Then perhaps," Richard said coldly, "you should have thought about that before you decided to treat one of the most respected operations executives in the country like your personal servant." The reality was finally sinking in. Leah was about to lose not just her comfortable living situation, but any chance of accessing the world of influence and power she'd been so desperate to enter. The man she'd spent 3 years humiliating was the key to everything she'd wanted, and she'd thrown it away through her own cruelty and arrogance. "Howard," she said, and there were actual tears in her eyes now. "Please, I know I made mistakes, but we're family. Surely we can work something out." Family, the word that had been used to manipulate me for 3 years, to justify every humiliation and indignity. The word that had never actually meant anything when it came to treating me with basic respect and dignity. I looked at this woman who'd systematically destroyed my sense of self-worth, who'd turned my grief into an opportunity for exploitation, who'd never once in 3 years treated me like a human being worthy of consideration. When I spoke, my voice was quiet but carried the weight of 3 years of accumulated pain and the strength of finally reclaimed dignity. "Family," I said, "doesn't treat each other the way you've treated me, and some betrayals are too deep to forgive." 3 weeks later, I stood in my kitchen making coffee for one, watching the sunrise paint the walls that Margaret and I had chosen together so many years ago. The silence in the house wasn't the oppressive quiet of loneliness anymore. It was the peaceful silence of a man who had reclaimed his own life. The moving truck had come and gone 2 days earlier. David and Leah had packed their belongings with the efficiency of people who knew they had no negotiating power left. There had been no dramatic confrontations, no tearful reconciliations, no last-minute pleas for forgiveness, just the quiet dismantling of 3 years of shared space and shattered illusions. David had tried to talk to me the night before they left. He'd knocked on my bedroom door, the master bedroom that I'd reclaimed the day after Richard's visit, and asked if we could have one final conversation. "I know I don't deserve it," he'd said, standing in the doorway like a child afraid to enter without permission. "But I need you to know that I understand now what I allowed to happen, what I participated in." I'd listened as he tried to explain, to apologize, to somehow bridge the chasm that had opened between us. He spoke about how overwhelmed he'd felt when Margaret died, how Leah had seemed to have all the answers about how to take care of me, how he'd gradually delegated the emotional labor of our relationship to his wife without realizing what he was giving up. "I stopped seeing you as my father," he'd admitted, his voice breaking. "I started seeing you as Leah saw you, as someone who needed to be managed rather than loved, someone whose feelings didn't matter as much as his usefulness." The honesty in his confession had touched something in me, but it hadn't erased 3 years of casual dismissal and systematic diminishment. Some wounds, I'd told him, take time to heal. Some relationships need space before they can be rebuilt. Some trust once broken requires more than words to repair. He'd nodded, tears streaming down his face, and asked if there was any chance for us to find our way back to each other someday. "I hope so," I'd told him, and meant it. "But that depends on who you choose to become from here, and whether you can learn to see me as I actually am, rather than as who you think I should be." Leah's departure had been more complicated. The woman who'd spent 3 years orchestrating my humiliation had tried various strategies to maintain some foothold in my life. First came the practical arguments. They couldn't afford a place of their own yet. They needed more time to save money. Surely I didn't want to see my own son struggle financially. When those failed, she'd tried emotional manipulation, reminding me of all the ways she'd helped me through my grief, suggesting that kicking them out proved I was as heartless as she'd always suspected, warning me that I'd regret pushing away the only family I had left. Finally, in desperation, she'd attempted to leverage her father's connection to me. If I'd just give them 6 more months, she promised, Richard would bring me into some of his business deals. We could all benefit from my expertise and connections. It would be a win-win situation for everyone involved. I'd listened to each appeal with the detached interest of a man watching a performance he'd seen too many times before. When she finally ran out of arguments, I'd given her my final answer. Leah, I'd said quietly, you spent 3 years proving that you see people only in terms of what they can do for you. Even now, when you're asking for mercy, you're calculating how to turn it to your advantage. That's not how family works. That's not how love works. And I'm too old to keep pretending otherwise. She'd left without saying goodbye. Now, standing in my quiet kitchen with my coffee and my thoughts, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Contentment, not happiness exactly. The scars were still too fresh for that, but a deep, abiding satisfaction in having reclaimed my dignity and my space. The house felt different without their presence. Larger somehow, but also more intimate. I'd spent the past 3 weeks slowly reclaiming the spaces that had been colonized by their lifestyle and preferences. Margaret's herb garden was growing again on the kitchen windowsill. Her favorite yellow curtains had been rehung. The family photos that Leah had deemed too cluttered were back on the mantelpiece. I'd also made some changes that were entirely my own. The dining room table had been moved back to its original position, with my chair restored to the head where it belonged. I'd converted David's old bedroom into a proper home office, complete with the awards and recognition certificates that I'd hidden away when Leah complained they made the house look too corporate. The phone had been ringing regularly, since word of my situation had somehow made its way through the business community. Richard, it seemed, had been more affected by our encounter than I'd initially realized. Without betraying any family confidences, he'd begun recommending me for consulting opportunities that matched my expertise and experience. Howard, he'd called to tell me just yesterday, Pinnacle Industries is looking for someone to oversee their merger integration. 6-month contract, very lucrative. I told them they couldn't do better than Howard Mitchell. The irony wasn't lost on me. Leah had spent 3 years trying to position herself and David to benefit from her father's business connections, never realizing that the key to those connections was living in her house and serving her dinner every night. But I wasn't bitter about the irony. If anything, I was grateful for the clarity it had provided. The experience had taught me something valuable about the difference between being needed and being valued, between being useful and being loved. Margaret's portrait sat on my nightstand now, returned from the closet where Leah had suggested I store it for my own healing process. Looking at her face each morning reminded me of what real partnership looked like, what genuine love felt like. She and I had built something together based on mutual respect and shared dreams. We'd never been perfect, but we'd never reduced each other to roles or functions or convenient services. I missed her more now than I had in months, but it was a clean missing, unmarked by the confusion and self-doubt that had clouded my grief for the past 3 years. I could remember her clearly again, not as the saint that grief had made her or the burden that Leah had suggested her memory had become, but as the complex, wonderful woman she'd actually been. The consulting work was good for me. It reminded me that my mind was still sharp, my expertise still valuable, my judgment still sound. But more than that, it reminded me that I had something to offer the world beyond household management and emotional labor. Yesterday, I'd had lunch with the CEO of a company I was helping restructure. We'd discussed market strategies and operational efficiencies, and at the end of the meal, he'd thanked me for insights that would save his company millions of dollars. Driving home afterward, I'd realized it was the first time in 3 years that someone had thanked me for my mind rather than my service. The house was quiet as I finished my coffee and prepared for another day of meaningful work, but it wasn't the oppressive quiet of isolation anymore. It was the peaceful quiet of a man who had learned the difference between being alone and being lonely, between being useful and being used. I thought about David sometimes, wondering how he and Leah were adjusting to life without their domestic support system. They'd rented a small apartment across town, and from what I'd heard through mutual acquaintances, they were struggling with the reality of managing their own household while maintaining their careers. Part of me, the part that had loved David since the moment he was born, hoped they would learn something valuable from the experience. Hoped they would develop appreciation for the work that goes into maintaining a home and a relationship. Hoped they would grow into people capable of seeing others as fully human rather than convenient functions. But I wasn't waiting for their transformation to validate my decision. I'd spent too many years of my life waiting for other people to appreciate my worth. Now I was focused on appreciating it myself. As I gathered my files for the day's consulting meeting, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. The man looking back at me was still 63 years old, still carrying the weight of recent grief and hard-learned lessons. But he stood straighter now, moved with purpose, looked at the world with clear eyes. He looked like Howard Mitchell again. The doorbell rang as I was putting on my jacket. Through the window, I could see a delivery truck in the driveway. The driver handed me a small package addressed in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a simple card and a photograph. The card read, "Mr. Mitchell, thought you might like to see this. Your advice saved our company and 800 jobs. Thank you for reminding us what real leadership looks like. Janet Morrison, CEO, Pinnacle Industries." The photograph showed the Pinnacle Industries workforce celebrating the successful completion of their merger. 800 people who still had jobs because of work I'd done in the quiet dignity of my home office, while Leah had assumed I was just passing time upstairs. I propped the photo on my mantelpiece next to the pictures of Margaret and David, a reminder that my life had meaning beyond the roles others tried to assign me. Then I picked up my car keys and headed out into a day that belonged entirely to me. For the first time in 3 years, I was free to be exactly who I was. Howard Mitchell, accomplished professional, loving father, devoted husband to a woman whose memory deserved better than the shame I'd been carrying. A man who had learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to accept less than you deserve. The house locked securely behind me, keeping safe the life I'd reclaimed and the peace I'd earned. I drove toward my future with the windows down and the radio playing, finally understanding what Margaret had always tried to tell me. Dignity isn't something others give you. It's something you give yourself. And once you take it back, no one can ever take it away again.